Let's begin this module then by looking specifically and concretely at premise and conclusion indicator words. Conclusion indicators are phrases, words that suggest that an inferential claim is being made. So, then, as a result, thus, therefore. These are all examples of conclusion indicators that you might find in a passage or in a bit of spoken language. Premise indicators are words or phrases that suggest that an inferential claim will be made, or that evidence is being offered, reasons are being given. So, for instance, the word because, the phrase for the reason that, the phrase given that. These are all suggestive of the introduction of information or premises. Now, in the Hurley text, usually in the first couple of pages, Hurley has a list of premise and conclusion indicators. And in the draft of the arguments chapter that I have posted, pages 17 and 18 contain fairly extensive lists of premise and conclusion indicator words. However, I have to introduce a caveat at this point. Be careful that you don't over-rely on the presence of such words, because such words and phrases have other uses. For example, when I was an undergraduate, I was both a philosophy and an English major. In philosophy, we talked about premise and conclusion indicator words. In English, we talked about transitional phrases. An example of a premise indicator word serving a premise indication function would be this use of since. You have $1 since you have 4 quarters. Conclusion, then premise indicator suggesting here's the reason why the conclusion is true. But since also has a temporal structuring function. Humans have had a presence in space since 1950. So the mere presence of since doesn't guarantee that a passage contains an argument. Here's a typical conclusion indication word serving that particular function. You ate dog. So you have something in common with a young Barack Obama. Premise, conclusion indication, statement to be concluded. However, so also has an adverb function. That last example was so stupid. In the second example, then, so doesn't function to indicate a conclusion. Rather, it functions to modify the verb phrase was stupid to indicate that it was very stupid or extremely stupid. The fact that premise and conclusion indicator words and phrases also serve other functions in the language gives us one reason to be careful about over-relying on their presence in diagnosing whether or not an argument is contained in a given bit of spoken or written language. There's also another reason. Nobody has to use premise or conclusion indicator words. The absence of premise and conclusion indicators does not in any way indicate that no argument will be found in a particular passage. In other words, passages without premise and conclusion indicators may still contain arguments. So the presence of premise or conclusion indicator phrases and words in a written or spoken passage can provide us with evidence or reasons that this passage might well contain an argument. There are other words and phrases that might also suggest that a bit of spoken or written language contains an argument. There are a number of logical form words that we'll look at in the next lecture when we look at the counterexample method. Words like all, some, no, if, then, either, or, both, and. These words all relate classes or statements to each other in a way that renders their logical structure. And so if we see a passage that has a number of these logical form words, this too can suggest that the passage contains an argument. For example, conditional statements are logical form words that often appear in written and spoken passages that contain arguments. They do so precisely because they relate two statements together in terms of their truth values. So recall that a conditional statement has two component statements to it. It has an antecedent statement, and that antecedent statement is the condition. It has a consequence statement, and that consequence statement is what's said to be linked to or follow from the antecedent statement. So a typical conditional statement will have a structure like, if this is Wednesday, then Wallace has office hours. If you're a dog, then you're a mammal. So they'll relate two component statements to each other in terms of the truth of the first statement, indicating that the second statement will also have that truth value, also be true. So when we see a passage that contains conditional statements, this too can suggest that the speaker or the writer is intending to link together statements in terms of their truth values, and so may well be making an argument. An important caveat here is that a single conditional statement, just by itself, if it's Wednesday, then Wallace has office hours, that is not an argument. Arguments are structured collections of statements. A conditional statement by itself cannot be an argument because we need at least one premise and one conclusion.